Hello and welcome to the thought of the day. Over the last few weeks, it's been rare that I have had a conversation with someone without the question of, I wonder what's going to happen next, arising. And sometimes it's phrased like that, and at other times it's phrased like, how long are we going to have to sit this out? Or I'm worried about the future. I'm not sure how much longer I can cope. And I wonder how many of us have uttered the words, it's the unknowing and the waiting that is difficult. And I wonder if this is the same kind of conversation that the disciples are having in the upper room in Luke chapter 24, verse 35 to 48. For these disciples are still very much living in grief in the Easter Saturday. They've heard tales of Jesus rising from the dead, but none of them, other than Peter, have seen and experienced this for themselves. And as they stood and as they talked, they found themselves in a room with a man who told them, "Peace be with you." And at first they're startled and they're terrified. They think they've seen a ghost, and frightened and doubting in their hearts, they realise that the person in front of them is Jesus. And the anxiety that was felt, the pain of waiting, and the shock of the reality was alleviated by only one thing: being present to the horrors of his wounds and the anxiety that they felt. When Jesus enters that upper room, the first thing he does is declare peace. But that peace only enters the disciples once they're invited to touch his wounds, his side, his hands, his feet. And in that moment, the space in Jesus' hands creates a space for peace to enter in. So what does that mean for us and for our anxieties at this time? Well, it would be tempting to think that we have to be present to the wounds of others 24/7 or keep in continual contact with those who drain us. At the moment, I know that this is a particular struggle for some of us, where we can enter into a cycle in which we continually feel that we have to look at the pain of others in order to think that we're more present to it, thinking that the more we consume or give out, the more we're somehow involved and helping. Now, that isn't to say that we should stop watching the news or listen to others. In fact, the opposite may be true for most, and for some, boundaries definitely do need to be put in place. But what it does mean is that when we're doing this, we need to be present to the reaction that it has in us. And if we're not aware of this, of the anxiety which we feel, or the activities that we busy ourselves with, we end up distracting us from the deeper questions that we are really afraid to confront. It serves us in the short term, but in the long term, it will take its toll. And for those of you who've lived with anxiety or hyperactivity or any sort of numbing practices, which by the way is all of us in one shape or another, you'll know what I mean. And Jesus tells us that the only way to feel safe enough to ask those questions is to be fully present. To be so grounded in the here and the now by touching and prodding and naming what scares us. When Jesus speaks to his followers and to us, he doesn't invite us to look at the pain and the scarring as a means of creating more fear, but as a way of getting us to see and admit that there's no peace within us in order to receive the peace that we so crave. He's saying, look, this is your deepest fear, death and pain, here it is. Look at it, touch it, prod it, name it. He's saying, I've walked the pain and the path of isolation and desolation, the path of death and suffering, and I am still here. And in the times when anxiety has bubbled up in me, this practice has served to be helpful, giving what scares me most a name. Imagining it as an object in my hand, I inspect it. I look at it and ask questions of it, and all of a sudden it seems smaller than when it simply existed in my head. And I invite Jesus' peace into the space I've just created, surrounding the object which I have now named. But Jesus does not meet his disciples simply to lessen their anxiety. Rather, the reaction in the disciples is one of joy and amazement. But we can't experience this when we continually think about the future or dwell in the past. It can only be experienced in the here and the now, in the partaking of everyday, ordinary tasks. And for Jesus and his disciples, it was in the sharing of a meal. Over the last week or so, I've recently taken to not wearing a watch, and it's been wonderful. I'm no longer looking down at it and wondering how much longer have I got left of the day, or how much longer until this is all over. Somehow it's alleviated some of the anxiety and the questions surrounding the not knowing and the waiting. I've set alarms for meetings, so hopefully they're not missed. But it's been a really interesting exercise in seeing how much more open to joy I've been. In the act of not watching the clock or the calendar, it forces me to be present to the activities in front of me, to the people in front of me, to Sophia and to myself, to my loved ones over the phone. And because I'm not rushing, I have time to be present to the reactions and the pain around me, and the emotions and thoughts that arise in the day, and the way my body reacts, its tensions and its relaxation points. And Jesus knows that when we're in the flow of the present, it makes us more open to him and to God's Spirit, because we're no longer worried about being in control, which is a major side effect of anxiety. We're able to see things as they are, the good and the bad, as the disciples saw things as they were. And in turn, as Jesus reminds us, this makes us witnesses to the work of God. And as those who see God at work, we cannot help but be people of joy. Not because we've ignored the pain which surrounds us, but because we have been courageously present to it, entering into it and through it, only by drawing upon God's indestructible resources of peace and joy and compassion. This week, may we be people of the present, open to these resources and knowing that there is peace to be had in the present.